Good morning, Mr. Kevin. It's been a pleasure. It was actually getting nice and meet you a little bit, talk to you a little bit over the phone. Had a chance to send some words back and forth as far as through Facebook Messenger. Um,
Mhm.
Curious, like when we started talking, I was didn't ask the question, how did you come across this podcast?
How did I come across this podcast? I believe most likely probably on Facebook because having written a book on PTSD, I'm engaged with certain pages and people, and I think it just triggers the algorithms to feed me, podcasts or advertisements that fit that, group of people.
Well, I know we spoke a bit about the book. I actually just said that we're going to end it. We're going to start off at the end first right now, and hearing a little
Okay.
bit about your story. What actually motivates you to write a book about mental health and PTSD?
You know, It's interesting because I really didn't have a plan to write a book. And what transpired was a couple events. First one is how I got the material for it. So I'm a Beirut veteran. And so we're talking, I'm the first half of the 1980s when I served, and not too far out after the Vietnam. And I went through my military service, and then I went through college. And then I had one final traumatic event occur because I hadn't taken care of my mental health. I had a breakdown, and it was fairly severe. I was very, very ill. And one of the challenges we faced back then, and this is very true with the Vietnam vets, is we had absolutely no resources. I mean, there literally was absolutely nothing to support us. Matter of fact, even when we left the military, I guess my last meeting might have been 30 minutes, signed some papers, and we left. And that was it. So we didn't have any resources. We didn't, we literally had, we didn't even have a fraction of the public, how engaged the public is today. There wasn't even that. There was just literally nobody to talk to. So I started the process of journaling because I was so very sick and I was a smart guy, but I couldn't figure out what was going on and just trying to process it. And I wrote and wrote and actually wrote for 15 years. So I'm 30 years of my healing. So I stopped writing quite a long time ago. Fast forward, we moved to Pennsylvania about 5 years ago, and I found over a banker's box of my journaling notes. I mean, that's a lot of notes. And at that point, my life, I'd gone through a transition. I did very well professionally. I was a field sales engineer, very capable, very smart guy. But in the early part of my 50s, my brain started going a little bit wonky. And by the time I was in my mid 50s, I was having actual cognitive issues. So, they're still working on that, whether it's TBI, neuropsych, or just PTSD, which is psychiatric. And it's probably all of them, honestly. So, I started making mistakes at work. And these weren't just like basic mistakes. And it wasn't like stupid mistakes. It was like mistakes I just couldn't process. I couldn't think. And I realized maybe my career of what I'd been trained to do was at an end. And I wanted to leave on top. And I did. It was a very smart decision to leave on top. I'd done some things financially that allowed me to retire. Plus, I'm a 100% disabled vet. And of course, having those monies made the transition easier. So the book, I wrote the book when I opened it up. And I've always done, I'd say for at least 20, 25 years, I've been doing different types of volunteer work, missionary volunteer work, but the majority of it's been focused on veterans, particularly around mental health issues. And I'd always done service work. I told a lot of stories during that time about what my life experiences were, how I overcame, always got positive reception. And then I got the idea, I saw these notes. I said, hey, I've actually got a book here. And I did. There was just some really tremendous content because I don't know if any of any other books. I'm sure there are, but there was something very unique on the notes. They generally fell into three categories. They were when I was very sick, so I was journaling what it was like to be very sick with post-traumatic stress disorder. I journaled for a period of time trying to crawl out of it, trying to get my arms wrapped around the complexity and the ugliness of it. And then I also journaled what it was like once I had my feet, established and was moving forward, things I were doing. So it was very raw, it was very real, some really good content. Now, of course, there was some not so good content, not in the sense that it wasn't good, but it made absolutely no sense. So, when you are suffering mental health issues, sometimes you write what's on your mind, and some of it made no sense. But anyhow, I took the notes and I, I put them in piles, and from those piles is what I created the current 16 chapters in the book, though there's actually good amount more material to either do a second book or to do a larger book, maybe a second generation of the book. So that's how the book came about. Now, the next thing that was the big change was the book that's there today is not the book I started with. Um, One of the things I did while writing a book was I was told, there's a lot of things you got to do. You want to make sure that your readers want to read it. It's just not your thoughts. Just because you write something doesn't mean anybody wants to read it. So you get people to read chapters of the book, and it happened to be the best and honestly the only readers I could find were people who I'd known who'd gone through some difficulties. I didn't exactly know how much. I said, "Hey, would you be willing to read this?" And it happened to be all of them had suffered some pretty severe trauma, worse than what I went through, domestic violence, childhood sexual assault, you know, abuse. And they read it and they said, "Wow, this really resonates." And I started thinking, wow, you've got an opportunity here to sort of go past the typical military narrative of that PTSD veteran experience. And so I made it what I call trauma agnostic. I went back in and I wiped out much of the military specific. I gave enough when it was appropriate, to let you know, hey, yeah, I'm still a veteran, I'm still here. But most of that was removed. And I rewrote probably a good third of the book, and just really trying to focus, because no matter what trauma you go through, there's a couple things I always tell people. One, don't compare your trauma to others. Sometimes, our culture likes to put, a veteran's trauma really high. It's noble, honorable, valor, all that. And I got into it when I really started talking to some of these people reading the book. I realized, my life sucked, and I really went through some very bad things. Some of it was horrific, but it honestly wasn't as bad as theirs. And I said, trauma is trauma. People handle trauma differently. But so I say, never compare your trauma. You think, oh, well, I didn't go what you went through. It doesn't matter. Trauma is trauma. Another thing I learned in sort of like how to pin the degree of trauma to the book was I've met some incredible people in my life. I'm 61, and I had the opportunity and sort of the smarts about me, 20 years ago, to talk to some of the last World War II veterans. I've met a number of, they were key people in World War II. Some incredible stories, and one was D-Day landing. What the guy told me was just horrific what had happened. And when he told me, he was just so calm. He was so matter of factly about it. Like, yeah, well, this happened, and he just kept going. And it's like, any person who saw what he saw would be, really traumatized, but he was not. Conversely, I've met people who've gone through some, what I would categorize as probably lighter level trauma, still important. I'm not discounting it, but I saw how much they were impacted. I mean, they were significantly impacted. They were literally taken down by it. So, each person sort of has their own experience. Each have their abilities to understand, accept, manage their trauma. but trauma is trauma, and that's when I talk to people, say, let's focus not on what the trauma is, but how do you evolve away from it, and hence the name of my book, walking from the shadows. The shadows was that dark period of my life and my journey. I talk about, the whole book is about healing, and that's again why I didn't focus on military, because there's so many people in so many different professions or life situations that face trauma. And so the book resonated, and so it was published in February.
So you talked about how trauma is trauma, and that's huge importance, especially with this whole podcast. The aspect that I'm trying to get out there is not just because you're a veteran that you suffered, but there's also things that happen as childhoods, or something that can happen as a domestic dispute or other areas, and not knowing how to talk, it can actually cause people to suffer in silence. And I like how you were able to strip away your military experience to make it more understandable instead of actually having this barrier between people that are veteran and non-vet, and realizing that their experiences
And it's
is
pretty
as
common. It's pretty common, and I encourage people, don't look at it that way. I think most veterans don't want you to look at it that way either. We don't feel like we're special. We're just you. We just had different experiences.
and I believe that's really important to actually help a person realize that we are not trying to cause this barrier because of what we did, what people have done. And the other aspect to it is that it's the trauma that impacts the person. And doing comparative suffering is like you're not able to get anywhere. You're not able to move forward with a person because you're saying, "Oh, yours is so much worse," or "Mine was so much worse." We stop listening to each other. We start reacting, and it doesn't allow us to really heal and understand how this person was impacted. Like I usually try to go back to the beginning of a person's story when they were a kid, because Angela Duckworth, actually Dr. Angela Duckworth, wrote this book, Grit, and they were talking about how does resiliency have a huge aspect of completing West Point or actually developing PTSD, or how you're able to work around it. So, but the next question I would go to is, how was your childhood, and how did it actually help
Good.
develop you to be the man that you are today?
It didn't. So the man I am today is the man I created. So my family structure was a mess. My father was a World War II veteran. He married older because of his service. He was gone for so many years and didn't start until later. He was a very difficult man, very angry. And, it's always perplexed me because he had so much to be absolutely grateful for, and he couldn't be. He could never find peace. And my family structure was one that he came from a dysfunctional family. My mother came from a dysfunctional family, and they were both emotionally immature people. And it was a very hostile household. My parents just fought constantly. They just, in for stupid things. I mean, looking back, I mean, I'm a very peaceful man myself. And, I was an above average smart kid. I actually didn't know how smart I was until about this past year when I had my IQ taken. It was 123. That's above average. But I was a very smart kid, very astute. And I said, wow, this just sucks. I don't like being here. I don't like my parents. And so, it was just maybe just by figuring it out, I just started spending a lot of time at my friends' houses. And that's what I did through most of my school. I was only at my home during necessary times. And by the time I was 16, I was ready to hit the road. And that's when I actually began talking to a Marine recruiter, and it wasn't a right fit. And I took the ASVAB, and I met a Navy recruiter, and he offered me the world. And I scored really high. I almost 96, I think, on ASVAB. Back then, that was considered high, and I had a lot of options. And I convinced my mom to sign me in. I was 2 months after my 17th birthday. I finished high school and I went to boot camp when I was 17. So I was a very young um, military member. But one of the things I realized, I come at this as an adult, is that I had laid the groundwork. I guess you could say I was traumatized by having been in that difficult environment. I was never abused, but it was just mentally fatiguing, if anything. And, when I thought going into the military would be a good escape, I mean, obviously it didn't require any money out of my pocket, no planning. I just got on the bus and left. I think in my wallet, I might have had $5 or $10 and that was it and nothing else. I mean, you got to remember back in the early 80s, there was nothing else. There were no cell phones. There was literally nothing. You'd have a couple pictures in your wallet and some cash and you were good to go. And so by the time I got to the Navy, I was already primed for PTSD. And that was one of the problems. And then of course, when I got in the Navy, I did well. I did exceptionally well in it. I flourished. I did well in all my schooling. I was a smart kid and, I made rank well. But I couldn't have anticipated, you guess what? A year and a half later, being sent over to the Middle East. So it was complicated back then because I think, in general, while they had ramped up our basic training because of the Middle East, specifically Beirut, which was a hot spot, there's a lot going on there, as there is now. They didn't adequately prepare us for what they were sending us into. I mean, we had been a peaceful nation for almost 10 years at that point. The Vietnam War was over, the Navy had been, and I think the whole public was sort of naive. They said, yeah, it's bad over there, it's going over, all stuff's going on, but it's over there. It really doesn't affect us, but it did. So I got over there, and my duty was absolutely terrible. And so I talk more about this when I'm in a military conversation, but I want to focus on what was happening to me mentally. I didn't have the skills. One, we weren't trained like the Marines were, for violence or for hostile situations. And also, I just don't think we as sailors were mentally prepared for what they would send us to. And so it made the ability to process information quite difficult. And I truly found myself scared, and rightfully so. As I look back and what happened in Beirut, we were a target as well. We were rightfully scared. I mean, it was just a very difficult time. So I kept having this sort of like layers of negative experiences and sort of broadening this cesspool of negative thoughts, negative behaviors, and that is actually when some of the negative stuff started creeping in to my behaviors. Of course, now looking back, I realize it's not healthy, um, but to somebody else who maybe, if you're active duty or you're coming out of it, it may not seem normal, but in context, it's normal when you go through, through enough trauma or enough violent situations that you start getting altered.
So the reason I was asking you about your childhood, and I like how you were able to explain about the Navy, and then also not being pretty much mentally prepared, as like you said, the Marine Corps, and the aspect that your father was not able to really talk to you the way that you needed it to, and it's kind
Mhm.
of like this generational trauma where my grandfather, the way that he handled stuff, he handled it with my father. My father did that to my brother. My great grandfather did that to my grandfather. And the breakdown of communication and be able to meet your kids where they're at. And at that time, like my grandfather was a World War II, my dad was a Vietnam vet, I was an OIF vet. And you see how like you start to talk to people, you start to see about how you can get your point across real quick, which is by yelling or aggression. And then physical
Mhm.
compliance causes a person to react or behave in a pattern that you want them to. And then when you start to actually break down that type of communication for a person, it makes it a little bit more. easier, but they're trying to get used to it. Now, joining the Navy, getting out of that house, being a very bright guy, like you were saying, going to boot camp is probably we used to. You guys had what are they called there? Because I know we have drill instructors, and then Army has drill sergeants. What is the
Company
Navy?
commanders. We
Say,
called them company commanders at the time.
so your company commanders were used to yelling at you, and you're probably like, "This is a
Yeah.
breeze." But the thing that I learned about war is that even though you could be battle ready or what you think you're ready for it, and then at the same time when you're there, it's like you want to go into that automation. And is war scary? Fuck yeah, it is. Especially like I remember the first
Yeah.
time we saw an IED was the second day I saw the wire. How many people I know that just stayed on the main fob and mortars scared the shit out of them, or the first time you had a
Mm.
round whizzing by your head, you're like, holy shit, I really can just die now. At the same time, it's like, the more that you're in there, the more normal place it becomes. And then when you're
Right.
in
You
a,
become desensitized in some way. Yeah.
and then when you're actually in a regular world situation, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. Or if you hear, for me, when I heard, "Doof," I was like, oh shit, is this going to be then? I was in Okinawa when I actually came back and I was going over to BAS, which is sick hole, because they were doing evaluations on us. And I dove into the grass as hard as I could, and I wiped off not my khakis, wow, my trousers, and I was like, holy shit! I was like, hopefully nobody saw this. I felt like a retard because I didn't know how to talk about things. I didn't know how to talk about how I was just stuck in time. So you guys coming back from Beirut, yeah, it's some people don't even realize how severe it was back then, and also on top of it, it's kind of a very unspoken place in a lot of
It
veterans'
is.
lives.
So, if I could pause you 1 second, and this is one of the failures of the time. So, you mentioned something. I don't know if it was just cultural or in the military, but people didn't talk about their feelings and emotions. And back then, there should have been, for some of the stuff we went through, debriefings. And I don't recall anything. I don't ever recall one of our chiefs or senior chiefs, which are E7, E8 in the Navy, ever just sitting down with the guys and say, okay, today was a tough day. This is what we're doing. It was poor. That lack of validation, I guess, or debriefing probably caused a lot of problems. And it was compounded by the fact that we sort of knew what was going on. Now, you got to remember, this is not the cell phone era. We weren't allowed, we were supposed not to be taking pictures as well. We were told not to take pictures. And of course, we had a little, in somatics, but we all took them. And we would get armed forces radio at evening, on the announcement, and we'd be hearing it, and it was often really tough to rationalize. We were part of something, but we didn't know what we were doing when we were doing it. But we would get little snippets later on in the day on the armed forces radio what had been going on. We're like, this is just this. It didn't make sense. And so there was a failure there. And I don't know if they debrief the soldiers, Marines today after, a difficult day. Say, okay, let's get, let's get down here. Let's get refocused. Let's, charge our batteries back up. They didn't give a shit. They really did. The grind. I write about this in my book, just the mental, physical grind. I don't know what your days were like, but I would say our typical days for months on end were 18 to 20 hours every day between work and duty. And you say, well, you got 6 hours sleep. Often, I mean, you would, depending what your rotation was, that wasn't all together. And you came to this place of utter exhaustion. And that exhaustion, too, was having the same level of deterioration on your mental health paralleled with the trauma. See these two forces coming together, and together they're pretty damn hard. And I'll tell you that's, of course, we can continue with what you're saying, but in your healing, sleep is like a nemesis for everybody, everybody. And you can see how those two, the trauma, the anguish from it, and then the lack of sleep, is just a really ugly cocktail.
So you just bring up sleep and then you bring up the trauma, the compounding trauma. So where a lot of people don't realize stage four of sleep, which would be your REM cycle, is where you start stripping away
Mm-hmm.
your emotions through your day. And I didn't know this until probably about a couple of years ago. Your sleep cycle matters a lot. And if you're supposed to sleep at 8 and say you wake up at 4 every day, and you go to sleep at 9 and you wake up at 5, you're jumping into your sleep cycle and it's screwing it up. It's not like all of a sudden the first minute is the first minute of sleep. And then when you continuously having fractured sleep, you're not able to really process what happened through the day. So that's also compounding because stage two and stage four really do a lot. Stage two is where you start stripping your happen through the day. You start
Mm-hmm.
categorizing it. You start being able to process a little bit. Stage four is when you get into that REM. Where's that emotion? What was actually in this stuff? And then the other aspect that you bring up, which is huge, is that it's continuous. It's not like you're relieved from the stress. Where when people actually think, oh, you had this downtime, no, there is no downtime. You don't have that thing to be able to help deflate it. When you are back to back to back, going out continuously pushing, 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 and then all of a sudden you have a little bit of time downtime. You're like, well, that you don't have a chance to say, oh, that sucks. You say, oh, yeah, that sucks. You move on. Like when I lost one of my friends, it was like, oh, they died. All right, we got to get back out. We got to do our job. We have to finish our mission. There's like no time for the mourning. There's no time to actually
Mm-hmm.
mourn what you did. There's
Mm-hmm.
nothing that you're doing about processing what type of actions that you did to be able to
Yeah.
survive or keep your buddies alive. So I think that's hugely important. And also on top of it, the mission. We'll say that we're there for America, but then at the same time, we're there for our battle buddies. We're there for our boys. We're there for the gals. And you realize that it's just a bunch of it has all this other kind of guilt. You have your moral injury that goes into it. You're like, hey, did I
Yeah.
actually mean to? I don't know this person, but I just engaged them and they engaged me. They're trying to kill me and I'm trying to kill them. And I don't even know this dude. We're just two
Yeah.
perceptions with two pawns. So not only is our trauma, we have this identity, and then we have this other perspective of what are we doing? It haunts us. So I can definitely, I can feel what you're saying where it comes to yeah, you don't have the chance to be able to process. And now, even when you get home, it's like try to get back after it, and then all of a sudden it's just like still not processing it. You don't have the, at least I didn't have it when I learned in the Marine Corps of how to process my emotions. You get out, you think it's gonna be the best thing, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's Jack Daniels or here's some beer, and let's get drunk because it's so much easier to crawl into that bottle for the short term relief, and then
Yeah. So I was talking about those negative behaviors, and for me, um, I self medicate with alcohol, but I like to drink, and I'm pretty athletic guy. Still, am athletic for my age. I'm 5'6". Want to give context. Every opportunity I could drink without it impacting my job. So, like if I had to be there on a Monday, I wouldn't be drinking Sunday night, but I might be drinking Sunday afternoon. But I was drinking. I did not become an alcoholic by the definition. However, I was a borderline alcoholic. I had a drinking problem. I was just drinking. I typically remember the number because I look at it now. It's outrageous. I don't drink now. A little guy drinking 9 or 10 beers every day. And just guzzling them just to you while you're numb. You didn't like that kind of numb. You were trying to create another kind of numb, and you're just trying to, and it would take shift your brain and your thoughts away, and then as you started sobering up, you felt even worse. And so for me, drinking was a very big problem. Though I would say when I got out of the service, I went to college. So I was a smart kid again, started going to classes. Really, I drank some, but I stopped the binge drinking. And that was the beginning of the end of my drinking. And I can speak to that. And, and now I embrace, because when I talk to younger guys, they love their beer and, or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But if you're having mental health concerns, I'm going to ask you one question. And it's the most profound question. An 80-year-old man told me this. He said, Kevin, are you better off with it, or are you better off without it? And if you look at it from that perspective, from over here, the answer. You're better off without it, particularly when you have that. And you're going to have to face your demons. You're not going to be able to self-medicate. People self-medicate in different ways, of course. Now, there's some do it under the guise of smoking pot. I'm not necessarily against that, but if you're using it as a tool to numb your situation and not address it, that's not cool. If it helps you, from a medical marijuana standpoint, it's helping you, sure. I'm not going to judge people, because people, we if you're in the VA, you're probably taking some kind of SSRI or psychotic type medication, one or two more. Um, but you have to get in the moment and say, this isn't working, I've got to move forward. And so we both, even though I'm much older than you, we have very similar paths on how do you decompress. They don't teach you how to do that. And looking back, if I was to tell a younger man, or I tell my younger self, somebody your age, start journaling. And I write about that in my book, about how to journal. I call it purposeful writing. You don't have to write pretty paragraphs and complete sentences. Mine changed. Mine were thoughts. Sometimes they're paragraphs. Sometimes they were bulletized ideas. Sometimes they were goals. Sometimes it was just, I was taking a table and, going, okay, this is how I'm feeling today. I'm high here, I'm low here. But learning how to get it out and get it in front of you is probably one of the first steps on how you can do that. And if anybody young is listening, I mean, you're just out of service, or if you're in service, or if say you're a spouse or sibling, get into that journaling. Probably one of the most powerful things you can do. And it ties back into, you were talking about sleep. If you can get it on paper, you're not guaranteed, but you're less likely to take it to bed with you. And that's what you're trying to do, is, you're trying to get it out of your head. You don't have to deal with it right there, but you need to get it out of your head, because it gets into your sleep. And we can talk about that too. I had horrible sleep, horrible, by the worst standards. But you got to start working to get it out of your head.
So when I was actually in the hospital for 13 weeks in a residential working on my PTSD, the way that I understood it and the way that it was really conveyed to me was what you're doing is you're taking your emotions and you're slapping it on a piece of paper. And a lot of times you might just do in a very unorthodox approach where it's allowing whatever's on your mind just to be out on paper. And what you're doing is you're creating a different neural pathway. Instead of just thinking about it going from A to B, now you're just choosing to write it down A to C. And if you choose just to allow the emotions just to pour out at first, like the way I'd say it is no punctuation, no really thoughts, no grammar, no spelling, no nothing, just being in a moment.
It doesn't
Now,
matter. It doesn't matter.
and then being the pretty much the verbal diarrhea onto the piece of paper. And then when it goes to write now what you're grateful for, you're actually changing the way that your brain is looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you're able to write down these thoughts, these intrusive perspectives, you're now actually trying, you're taking the weight out. You're actually giving it an outlet. You're giving it breath and you're giving it life. So then it's able to move on. And a lot of times, what we'll do is that when we're not actually going through the paper, we're just, and if you reread what you wrote, you can actually stir up a bunch of other stuff. But what it does, it actually changes your narrative of what you're actually seeing on paper. And
Exactly.
You talked about you bring it back to sleep. So Dr. Matthew Walker wrote a book. It says Why We Sleep. He did a really good um, way of conveying about how alcohol and marijuana specifically, and he does a huge thing with Dr. Andrew Huberman on Huberman podcast, where you are sedating yourself. You're not really getting sleep. What you're doing is you're sedation and you're just moving through the moments. And even though it gets you with your eyes closed and your brain kind of shut down, at the same time, it's blocking your REM. And it goes back to even say when
Mm,
you're
mm,
drunk or you're high, what you're doing is you're putting almost like a film over it, so it's not able to fully leak out. It's actually just being distorted and it's still staying there, resonating. And way the my psychologist that did a lot of my deep therapy, Dr. David Gately, absolutely brilliant man. I still keep in touch with him from time to time to let him know what's going on. And what you're doing is that when you're taking the substances out and you're actually feeling the emotions, and this is a big thing that people don't talk about with anti-anxiety and antidepressant pills, they believe that the pain is going to go away. But what it's supposed to do is actually control the high vibrational swings of the anxiety or the depression. But
mm,
when you're able to sit inside that moment, that emotional moment, you're allowing yourself to feel safe. Subconsciously, you're putting yourself into a safe type of place. And then when you're processing these emotions, you're not having those huge swings, but you're able to start to feel it more towards the center, more towards what it is as a historical event.
mm,
And
mm,
I feel where we don't really talk about enough is about how important it is to start processing it instead of kicking the can down the road. Because I realize about how much we bleed into other people's that we love. For instance, the way my father's father, my father's father's father, your father,
mm,
it's about how to help people realize it's okay to talk.
mhm, mhm, mhm. You know, I want to tell a little bit so people understand about the sleeps. Again, you got to remember 30 years ago, 30 plus years ago, we didn't have this wisdom. It may have been there, but it was still mostly analytical and it was only for the professionals, you know, the Sigmund Freuds of the world. It wasn't for the mass public. And part of my difficult understanding what was happening to me, what was happening in my sleep. So my sleep was bad. The first 3 years, and this is from my breakdown, about 3 years out, I was typical of PTSD with the nightmares. And at that time, I wasn't aware of night terror. And a lot of people aren't aware of the difference. There's a difference between that, and you can discuss it later if it need be. It was so horrific. That was part of what led me to, with that, on top of the trauma, the lack of sleep was the terror. And I couldn't take it anymore. And that's what led me to my first suicide attempt. So what was happening was I did not want to sleep because I knew what was ahead of me. Uh, I knew what every night I had the the nightmares and the sweating and the screaming and the crying. It was bad, and so I would stay up until I would pass out from exhaustion. And don't know if I really would call it ever sleep, but unfortunately, then I would be jerked back out of it by the nightmares, and I kept that pattern. And during the day, I mean, I knew that was going on, and the way I stayed awake during the day, I was working, high functioning. It was nuts. I was living a lie. I was drinking so much coffee. I was probably drinking over a pot of coffee a day, every day, just to keep me going, just to get me through work, keep the paycheck. I single by myself, so I didn't have, and far away from anybody, didn't have any friends, new job. I didn't have any support, so I had no choice to fail, but I was living a lie. And then after about 3 years, you know, I had been journaling, and it started getting better. No, I still had it, and it would journal. And you know, a couple of years later, I got married. My wife was a nurse, I was very fortunate there because her being medically trained, she knew what was going on. And when I would have these events, and I still have them now, maybe every couple months, but they're not very severe. She would wake me up and put me back to bed. I'd never even know what was going on. She'd comfort me, calm me down, tuck me back in, and I'd go back to sleep. I know early on I talk about this, and for for partners, anybody has a partner and you're sleeping with them, they need to be mentally prepared that you might act out in your sleep. So I would throw my arms, and I know I hit my wife a number of times, not purposely, of course, just like boom, you're swinging at something or you're fighting in your dreams, and you need to have a strategy on agreed upon strategy before you go to bed. What do we do? In some cases, if it was bad enough, my wife would wake me up. My wife would take me to the bathroom, wipe me off, clean me up. There were points where I remember the bed being absolutely saturated with sweat. And my worst night terror, and if people aren't aware of night terror, that's what happens in the middle of the night, not in your REM. I was hit, throwing my arms so much. I had welts on my hand from hitting the bed and stuff, and my fingers hurting. Of course, you wake up, you see, sweated out pillow or sweated out sheets, what's going on. But it does get better. And I think probably in hindsight, the number one thing that was doing it may have been the journaling, because as I was proceeding, I was journaling. Now, one thing I want to add, when you journal, and I wish I'd known this early on, is when you go back and read it, take a pen and underline a few of the key words that were the driving message of that and date it. I didn't realize how important that would be later on to take that information to a therapist. Now, you look at that, you have all this written down information. Very, very useful. Particularly, you keep having the same dream or the same thought, the same grief, the same shame, whatever it may be. If there's a pattern, you could say, hey, I keep seeing this. And that could very well be a good structure or starting point for therapy. Or you say, okay, in my case, because I was by myself, I would take that and then go, I want to explore this a little bit more, and I want to, learn about what's going on. So I was obliged to learn more, okay, because I didn't have a therapist. And even when I started therapy, I would say for the first 10 years, despite maybe having 4 or 5 therapists in that period of time, on and off, different durations, not one ever pegged me with PTSD. It wasn't until I got into the VA that they said, "Oh my God, you've got PTSD," and I'm like, "What's PTSD?" So I actually had PTSD, but I didn't know what it was. So 10 years out, I'll come, but go back, highlight those key things, try to see if there's any patterns. You know, Later that could be really helpful for you to have all these data points to share. Say, I keep having this same dream. So I used to have a couple dreams. There are two dreams in particular because I had them so many times. One, I was always being chased and shot at, and that one was frightening. And another one was I was flying, and I don't know why I was flying, but I would fly. And I remember in my dreams, I could actually feel my stomach dropping out, just like it does on a roller coaster when I'm flying through the air. Kept saying that, so get down the detail. I don't know if you had similar experiences like that, but I guess I'm not too unusual because as I've spoken to other veterans, they too have had some of these same patterns.
So talking about night terrors, I remember how many times I woke up and pee in the bed, not just sweats but urine.
Mm,
Talked about,
okay.
and when you were talking about hitting my ex-wife, like I injured her pretty good in my sleep, and I remember how much shame came across it. And it was, if I remember correctly, it was like woke up, broke our orbital socket, fractured a jaw before when I was asleep. I was actually about 300 pounds at that time, and it wasn't a wake up call. It wasn't a wake up call enough for me to be able to actually do help. And I realized how much shame I had in it. And I thought if I actually was to tell somebody, I would get locked up or I would be institutionalized, which probably was been the best thing for me at that time.
I
And
actually say the same thing. I actually say I wish I had been institutionalized when on my breakdown. Absolutely. I concur.
Like my ex-wife, absolutely great human being. He's absolutely amazing. And I'm really glad that we got divorced because she's much happier now. And at that time, I was not ready for the healing. I wanted to be better, but I didn't want to do the work. How many of us have actually said this happened to us? They should be able to fix us. And I really commend you when you're saying that you brought your journal into therapy. One of the things I do in my job right now is I tell people to go to therapy and have a plan. Talk about this stuff. Don't be afraid to actually get into it. A lot of times we have so much shame and guilt, and that's actually what keeps us from healing. And the aspect that I say is, it's paraphrasing Carl Jung when he says, if you really love somebody, you're going to be the best version of yourself. And it's so hard for people to be able to want to love themselves when they feel like they've been so violent, they've been so vile, they've been so
Mm-hmm.
evil, and they have such a negative connotation of themselves. And when you talked about dreams, what was coming to my mind was there's been plenty of dreams where I feel like I just running around and I had no rifles, searching dead bodies, looking for a rifle to get back into the fight. And for a while, it took me for why did I actually believe and why did I have that dream? Well, at the same time, I don't have a rifle now. I didn't own a firearm until not too long ago until I have friends that I can actually trust to say, hey, I'm not feeling right. Here's my pistol, hold on to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have good relationships with people like that. But I remember how much I missed combat, how much I missed being in war, how much I missed being alive, how much I missed being with my buddies. And as much as it sucks, like the situation, I never felt so alive. I never felt like I was at this apex before. And at the same time, it we don't talk about that enough, where this made us feel so there, so in the moment. And then there's so much shame about it because it's like you keep getting distant off, but that's also what's actually hurting a lot of relationships. And it's like, why do we want
Mm-hmm.
this? It's the same thing as alcohol. Alcohol, we want it because it's able to avoid. We want to be in combat because it's so much to avoid. And you're able to be in some type of absolute control in that moment, or the appearance of absolute control. So the dreams resonate with me. The night terrors resonate with me. They resonate with a lot of people. I really do believe that
Mm-hmm.
if people actually shared, hey, yeah, you know what? Pissing yourself is pretty fucking normal when you're actually asleep. Hey, I was scared shitless. I was scared shitless. I woke up
Mm-hmm.
and I was sweating or I peed or I didn't like I hurt myself. Well, that's a sign. It's a sign that you physically your
I remember
body is
one night waking up in sweat in the bed. I did not know it was functionally, humanly possible for a human being to sweat that much while you're asleep. It was like I was scared. I mean, I knew I got, oh my God, I am really sick here. You're talking about partners. I've been blessed. I have been married now almost 30 years. Now, I think possibly because I was obliged to care for myself and really try to understand, part of the also journaling, I want to finish one thing there, but I want to talk relationships. You need to journal all the time. And I use the same book then, but I sort of approach the same way now. I journal every single therapy session. I journal every doctor's appointment, and I journal other things as well. So when I was teaching myself, I'd read a book, I'd see something, I'd write down something, the author's name, the page. Later, I suggest, we didn't have YouTube at the time, but I'd watch an episode and I'd see something. All of this data can really come together, but you want the same binder. With me, with my relationship, because I was not my father. I mean, my father showed me what not to be, and I learned that very early, and I chose not to be. And after you break down mentally, you can go to hell, or you can say, you know what, I really want to turn my life around. And I changed a lot of things in myself, and I was very open, and that's where my wife came in. I married well. My wife is very smart woman, and she had a liberal arts degree. Her degree was in philosophy and religious study, and just very smart, wise woman. And I was open though, and this is very big. If you are a veteran and your wife is, or your partner, I shouldn't say that, your partner is giving you signs, practice some humility and listen. So I did. And one of the biggest issues I face, and of course, this is generational and cultural, and it's still sort of cultural, is that guys don't know how to express their feelings. As a matter of fact, mine was even more extensive than that. I didn't know what the hell I was feeling. And, I learned this as an adult because I've got kids. I've got two boys of my own and fostered four others. I taught them how to, we're feeling, what are you feeling? You have to sort of lead them forward. What is this? I don't feel angry, but I'm just really overwhelmed or I'm really frustrated. What is this I'm feeling? And my wife helped me identify my feelings to put words to what was going on. And that too would eventually help my journaling. But my wife helped me learn what my feelings were, and then I learned how to express them. And of course, if you have PTSD, one of the problems you face is you become numb to other people's feelings. For me, for sure, you know, I think I was almost indifferent. I was so worried about myself. I saw somebody else suffering, like, eh, you know I had to teach myself how to be compassionate, not just towards myself but to be others. It didn't feel normal, because my I've been just so altered, emotionally, and I had to retrain myself, teach myself, and my wife was instrumental in doing that, and I'm very grateful for that. And I encourage people, if you're struggling to put understanding to what you're feeling, that is just another reason, one, to learn, but another reason to journal.
It's important to journal when you're in a good mood. It's important to journal when you're in a bad mood. The other thing I would add to it, which you pretty much clearly conveyed, is that you're able to relive that event again and not
Mm-hmm.
actually just
Mm-hmm.
be experiencing it for the first time. You're able to allow yourself to soak into it, be able to translate what your brain
Mm-hmm.
thought. When you talked about emotions, it was, I don't know if you saw my face, but it lit up and I was just like, yep. So, my job, a lot of what I actually tell people and I talk to them about is that there's no such thing as a bad emotion. I remember a chaplain, she took the time out and she said, hey, Will, there's no such thing as a negative emotion. They're just emotions. And when we're able to really clearly identify what the emotion is, it's no longer an emotion. You're able to understand where it's coming from. And a lot of times, for a long time, the only thing that was acceptable was either anger or happiness. And they're not even on the same spectrum. Like, I remember how many times I would actually go from happy to anger or from sad to anger just to be able to be in
Mm-hmm.
somewhat control and somewhat normalized. And as men, we had a hard time actually learning that it's okay to be sad, to be frustrated, to be glad, to be the spectrum of it. And when we actually are able to understand that, we're able to be there more for the kids, more for our spouses, more for the people that is around us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
I want to take that. If I could add another layer to that, I actually I talk about the word overwhelming because a lot of people who have PTSD or mental health issues say I'm overwhelmed. I write about it in my book. I don't like the word. And I want to walk through that because one of the challenges I faced is overwhelmed is really not a symptom. It really isn't anything. It's a generalized word for many things. So, where I try to get people to talk more about their feelings. So, say, like, one day you could say, I'm overwhelmed. But why are you overwhelmed? Well, I'm really angry and a little bit sad today. Okay. So, you're really angry today. Tomorrow's a new day. You say, I'm overwhelmed again. Well, why are you overwhelmed today? Well, I had a really bad night sleep. I'm really sad. I've been thinking about, the loss of something. I'm not that angry, but, I'm just not feeling good. So the problem is when you use generalized words like overwhelmed, day one, day two, you may be just as overwhelmed, but there's different sub factors to it. And why it's so very important what you're saying, get down to those feelings, what's driving it. Because what you find out with the words like overwhelmed or coping skills or depression, they're just too general. You got to get into the details of it. And what I found too is a lot of times the words we are trained to use or we know to use, like those, they infer that they're steady state and they're nothing but. I don't know if they have them anymore, but I use the analogy of a water bed. If you step on one corner, the other three corners go up. I go, oh my God, now I got to get the water down. You move on the bed and step on another corner, and then it goes back up. What I found was, particularly with my symptoms, the greatest challenge, and I would probably argue everybody who listens to this who's been in a difficult emotional situation is you'll have a predominant group of symptoms, issues you're dealing with, but the intensities change from day to day. So, sort of like what you were talking about there, being angry one minute and being happy the next minute, that happens. And so, one of the things I also started doing was I was looking at that and say, okay, do I feel more angry in the morning or at night? Do I feel more sad in the morning or do I feel at night? I even try to get down granular, and I suggest you do tables, particularly if you're having a rough spot. Okay, what is really going on here? And so I just want to insert that where you work to that, because I absolutely agree with what you just said.
So you brought up overwhelmed. The other component I will add about the emotions and overwhelmed. Well,
Mhm.
think about how many times we have these additional stresses in our life. We have it with our childhood. We have it with our life, the way it experiences, the flare-ups from our post-traumatic stress, the perspectives of how we are trying to navigate life, also being in control. At this point in our life, I was having this conversation with a buddy. He's like, is there ever going to be a point when you don't need something or you're not going to need the mental health? Is it actually about the emotion? I said, what it does, it actually helps you start to break down some of those ground layers. So, say if you have supposed to have 100% bandwidth and about 70% of it is mostly trauma, now you got 30% to be able to handle all the other bullshit. And now all of a
Mm.
sudden you have a night terror, you're up to about 82, you have 18%. You've been eating like shit lately because you've been depressed. Now you're up at 93, and they're like, "Why are you starting to feel overwhelmed?" Well, it's a collaboration of a bunch of stuff, but it's also I haven't been really taught how to decompress, how to actually be able to acknowledge what's happening in my body. That's why yoga or meditation is so huge. That's why therapy is huge. That's why praying is great. There's people that do these retreats to be able to help them bring up this monster and be able to decompress it. But at the same time, it's when we're looking at these narratives, it's how do we now change them? How do we switch them? How do we actually give breath to it and be able to give breath to parts of our lives that we are just totally denying for a while? And coming from how we are predominantly, like historically, men were sacrificial lambs over the years. You send them to war, you send them to hunt, you send them to a lot of different areas. And we were raised in a society, and this is why people say chivalry is dead, to be able to sacrifice our bodies, stand closer to the road just in case a car comes up or you get splashed with cold water. It's about how do we actually give ourselves to be able to protect and actually not be about ourselves. And if we're the more selfless we are, the more that we have to not be able to pay attention. And since the feminist revolution, it's inspired men to be able to talk about their emotions and be able to ask, what about me? What about us? And what I've noticed is that when people are able to give breath to that, they're able to have a better life. They're able to have more of a general life with other people, being able to care. But I think it's important to be able to discuss it where it's not a bad thing, it's a healthy thing. But then also on the same time, it's how do you allow yourself to just also be in the moment, not trying to categorize it, but also be able to say, how is my breathing feeling? How am I actually feeling? Am I able to laugh? Am I able to joke? Am I able to just
Mhm.
be? And so much of our life, we're on survival mode where we're not actually doing that. So I honestly really do agree with the whole thing of healing. And there's going to be another episode I will have with, and it's actually about what does healing look like and how do you actually keep moving, changing your behaviors now to get closer to who you are. And not just being
Well,
about,
for sure, I can talk about that. Being, I've actually embraced. I was mature. I held myself accountable. And of course, I wrote a book. One thing you were talking about all these parts, and I developed a term. I don't know if anybody ever did it in psychology before, but when I wrote the book, you got to remember I was a field sales engineer, so I look at things differently. I dissect them and rebuild things differently than most people. And I developed this term called mind share. And this is very important. I can't emphasize this enough, and I'm glad I can speak of it here. So I developed this mathematical number called mind share. And if you take a typical day and you say, okay, I'm I've got negative thoughts 4 hours a day, you look over a month period of time, that's a lot of hours. That's over 100 hours, 120 hours. Probably for people who are really sick, it was a lot more than that. And I looked at it and I said, well, you hear this saying, well, how long does it take to heal? Or how long do you have to go to a therapist? Well, if you're going to a therapist, a lot of people can only afford to go once a month if they can get there once a month. But say you go twice a month, okay? And for 50 minutes, you're talking 100 minutes of time you're working to do positive things with yourself versus that 120 hours of negative thoughts. So, to your friend's question is, it never ends, but maybe the source of the growth comes from different places. For me, it would eventually be grounding. It was essentially grounding techniques. I didn't know that's what I was doing, but that's why I came, and I would go walking, and I was so numb I couldn't feel or I couldn't hear anything. Eventually, I started to smell again. Learned how to breathe, so I started taking time to do breath work, sitting there, meditating, praying, positive thoughts. I do positive affirmations every morning. I research topics, whether it's YouTube, all that. If you keep adding into that emotional bank account, in Mindshare, that percentage is going from 1 or 2% up to 10 or 20%. I don't know if it really matters at some point if you go to a therapist, where I think therapists and a good therapist, and you're aware of this, not all of them are, I don't want to say good. I like to say adequate for certain types of traumas because they weren't trained in trauma therapy. But there are just some topics you have to be guided through them because they're so difficult, they're so complex. They sort of know how to dissect them and break them down into smaller, manageable parts so you can deal with them. Most, even M60, the last part I had to deal with, I had to deal with the reality of death, and it was a very difficult conversation to have. Uh, I know for sure that every single therapist I've ever seen that never served in the military, they said they understood it. I think from an intellectual standpoint, they stood it, but they didn't feel it. They didn't really deeply understand it in that veteran rapport kind of way. And I found a veteran therapist, and he helped me walk through that. And eventually, I also ended up in a support group. And I chose to go older, so I was sitting down with Vietnam vets. And it literally, that was the final parts where I said, wow, I want to work through these parts. And I heard other men older than I, how they dealt with it, how they rationalized it, how they came to terms with it. So, do you need therapy? Of course you do, but it will look differently at different points of your life because remember, you're a human being. I'm not the man that I was when I was 50. I'm not the man when I was 30 when I tried killing myself. I'm a different man. So you've got other life changes, other things influencing you become wiser, more mature, more life experiences. So your needs evolve, but I would say you need help along the way from somebody who is bigger than yourself. It isn't about needing it, it's about finding somebody who can give it. It's possible a friend, possibly old person. Not necessarily does have to be a licensed therapist per se, but I would argue it doesn't end, particularly when you have PTSD. I have PTSD, and I like how the VA looks at it. This is the last touch point. The VA doesn't just look at you as, oh, you've got PTSD. They've got five layers of it. They got, I think it's 10, 30, 50, 70, and 100. I'm 70. So what 70% PTSD in the VA means, it means my symptoms are nearly constant. And they are. I mean, and it was pretty bad. I'm well managed now, but nearly constant. Well, a lot of that's just never going to go away. You have to learn how to be a project manager and how to manage through that. And as life changes, other things come to factor, health, age, um, it will alter it. And then you have to address it. You're not a steady state human being. Life continues changing with or without you.
So I liked how you brought up a therapist, and I've heard this so many times where, hey, I need somebody that has been through it. Where there'd be a vet saying, hey, I need another veteran therapist. I will tell you myself, when I first started doing therapy, I had no idea how to do it. I sat on a couch, asked them to teach me. They didn't know how to
Mm-hmm.
answer the question. I didn't know how to ask the question really. And then I went
Mm-hmm.
to a Vietnam vet that was actually a social worker. He was able to break me open a little bit. But what I
Mm-hmm.
will actually say, and this is just my opinion, this is not everybody's, is that sometimes a person not knowing what I've been through will help me be able to explain it a lot clearer. And it also explained it a lot clearer to myself. The other aspect was I sat with Tara Brunswick. Tara Brunswick, absolutely amazing human. I was the typical veteran that would actually show up, disappear, show up, disappear. And if anybody knows what that is, it's just like, hey, I'm wasting a lot of sessions that other people could be in. And I felt bad about it in the future. But at the same time, I didn't know how bad everything was until my second suicide attempt. And when I got there, it was either shit or get off the pot. And that's when I put myself into an acute psychiatric unit for 7 days. And then when I went through that,
Mm-hmm.
when I was there, I would say, hey, if this doesn't work, I'm going to end my life. And then but I gave myself the time to be able to go to a residential, which took about a month and a half. And I went there for 13 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
that's when I was vulnerable enough to allow Dr. David Gately to help me out. And on top of it, when I actually look back and I'm looking at all these parts, I did not know how to accept love. I didn't know how to give love. So I felt like just a vessel that
I
was moving
agree.
through.
I was the same, by the way. I sort of alluded to that earlier, how you couldn't express emotions or feeling to others. I recognize that. Continue.
It was an occupational therapist that had me read the book Five Languages of Love. And then I realized that it's not only the way that I show it and I receive it, but being able to accept the way that they want to show it. And for them to accept the way I want to receive it, not just all about me. It's also about how am I communicating this. And when we have these types
Mm-hmm.
of traumas, a lot of it becomes about the individual. It doesn't become about the surroundings. But when we're going to therapy, I remember what I did was like, hey, you know what? You gave me a bunch of skill sets. I'm gonna go fail a shit ton of times so I could be able to learn what's actually working, what's not, instead of just being there. I used to see a therapist once a week. Now I'm doing it once a month, and the one of the aspects that I actually got from when I was in the hospital was radical rejection. I'm going to give you me. I'm taking my mask off. This is who I am. If you like it, great. If you don't like it, amazing. That means that I don't have to keep rejecting myself and make myself seem smaller for you to be able to love me. And when that happened, I started to feel more confident and I started feeling more loved and I started to be able to
Mm-hmm.
be seen. When we think about how these emotions and then also how these traumas have actually minimized us, we don't usually talk about how our typical behaviors are being impacted and then how we're actually giving to a
Mm-hmm.
person. It's really important for that type of development as a human to continue to grow. Where I
I'm going to pause you there. You made me think of something. Just pause your thought. One thing of advice of the old guy. Again, this is the old guy talking to the 30-year-old Kevin a long time ago. When you're learning these things that you're speaking about, what I recognized is it will feel very uncomfortable. It'll feel weird. It'll go like, this is illogical. Why am I doing this? It just doesn't feel right. And what I tell people to do is fake it till you make it. You practice those things, whether because and once you practice and you start doing it, that practice becomes a habit, and then the habit evolves into a natural response mechanism. That's how I segued from doing what you were talking about into actually feeling love, feeling compassion. I'm a very loving, compassionate man now. 30 years ago, I was an asshole. I was an utter asshole, and I couldn't help it. I was so sick. So I just wanted to insert that there.
No, I appreciate it. It was something that I overlooked, and it's so true. It's because the uncomfortability is the thing that we move around. Think about us being guys, we want to be perfect. We're coming from a world that things
Mm.
were had to be perfect, otherwise people died. And it's crazy to even and I forgot about that. So I really do appreciate you pausing that thought. It's I find it interesting. And you and I will hopefully do another one after this. And I wanted to get into some other areas because you and I could talk about
Sure.
different theories of trauma, different theories of sleep, and all these different areas of benefits. Because you're, like you said to me many times, is you could talk on these aspects from a multitude of layers, and you can. You're a very bright guy. You're able to share your insight and able to break it down to a person that is more in an infantile stage of their journey, which I do appreciate. You when you wrote this book, because I know you went to writing this book, and what was your initial thought, and what was the initial message that you really wanted to get out? And then after listening to people and subtracting a lot of the military to be able to get that message out and be clearer or more fine,
Sure.
have they
Well,
shifted much or have they been pretty much on the same
I think
trajectory?
it shifted. I think it shifted. Yeah. Well, I was sort of tempered, as I noted earlier. I'd done a lot of volunteer work, particularly around PTSD advocacy. I was doing it 20 years ago before it was cool. I mean, at that point, I saw the value of it and I saw the impact. And when I wrote the book, I said, deep down, I really wish I could share my wisdom with younger people, in particular, though this is very relevant to older people, but to younger people. And I had this experience. One of the projects I did was at a VA nursing home, and this was early on. And I got partnered up with this really old woman. Her name was Susie, and I was very sick. And we are there to go cheer them up. But for some reason, I just started spilling my beans, all the stuff that happened and my suicide attempt and all that. And this old woman, held my hand and looked at me, and she said, "Young man, you still have the rest of your life ahead of you." And that's become what my message has been to anybody. You still have a lot of your life ahead of you. Now, I would find that this woman was a nurse in World War One who worked on the front lines in Europe. So she knew what she was looking at there. She had seen me before. She had seen guys like you before. She knew it. And she put my life into perspective. And what I would ultimately learn is that there's hope. You've got a lot of, yes, you could have been through a very difficult time in your life. You could have been through absolute hell. I went through absolute hell, but there's still a lot of hope and you can do a lot of good. And part of your healing, I talk about this in the chapter giving. I started realizing the more I got involved, sometimes my life, as bad as it wasn't as bad as the environments I was injecting myself into to help people. And I said, wow, you can really help people. Another part of the book became things I wish I had heard early on that I think would have helped me uh, enter into the healing stage and helped expedite it a little bit faster. We don't talk about this enough. We always call it like mental health, but as we get better into the technology of the brain, I'm talking actual technology, MRIs. I mean, there's this Dr. Pearl who did some work on Ryan Larkin's brain, and using a new kind of MRI, found scarring on his brain. The young man, unfortunately, he was a SEAL. He committed suicide, but they found scarring on his brain. Wow, that's a beginning of something new. But if you've been traumatized, if somebody asks you, how are you doing? Oh, I'm doing fine. You probably aren't. You have been changed. Your brain has changed. And I wish I had known that. I wish somebody said, Kevin, you think you're okay, but I think you're not. This is what could have happened. Your prefrontal cortex or your amygdala, you've got problems going on there. By the way, and unfortunately, this probably means your brain has been rewired as well. And one of the things when your brain is rewired, your brain can have a tendency to try to trick you. So it can make you think things that aren't necessarily real. And I spend an awful lot of time in my book talking about this one concept. I had to practice and practice thousands of times, and I still use it occasionally, where if I'm thinking something, it doesn't seem right. I say, Kevin, is that real or is it not real? And can you control it? And can you not control it? And some of those things, had I understood that very early on, it's just not your thoughts, it's just not mental health. Your brain has been changed. And if you understand that, it's driving you more just from a mental health perspective, but you've got a physical issue. You've changed. And if you understand that, you're going to be a little bit kinder to yourself. If you were in a car accident and you hurt your back, well, you're not going to say, oh, that it's just pain. No, your spine was injured. And that's sort of how I try to transition people to look at it maybe a little bit different. You've been changed, and it's okay, and there's some things that you can do to better manage it.
I like how you brought up you changed, your mind changed. Is it real? Is it not real? It's I shared this before, and I share this with people I work with, and also, so I work as a peer specialist for the VA, and
Hmm.
the thing I add to them, I said, hey, you know what? It's like kind of that safety voice in your brain that goes off, and it's like, hey, look out for this. And I joke with them. I say, my butthole still puckers sometimes when I go across potholes, or if I see something hanging from the wires. And I throw it out there to them because I'm like, one, I throw it in such a way that is not so clinical because I wanted to do that, that little laugh that you
Hmm.
did. I wanted to throw them off kilter
Hmm.
so that they actually come back in. The
Hmm.
thing I say is like, you know what? When that comes up, I'm like, thank you, Will. Thank you for getting my back today. Instead of the way I used to be, like,
Hmm.
why the fuck can't I just be? And now I'm like, oh, no, no, I'm actually able to. You got my back. I appreciate that. You
Hmm.
got that spidey sense. And when we actually switch the narratives, when we're able to help tweak the perspectives of what we think this thing is controlling us to actually being helping us or supporting us to be able to keep us alive, instead of actually realizing that we have designed this security system to keep us safe.
And that's it. That's exactly what's going on. I mean, where one of the things I really had to work hard when it comes to that matter was learning how to reframe my thoughts. I speak about this as well. Boy, that is a tough one to do. I give the example like you all of a sudden you get angry and you say or do something you really wish you hadn't said or done, but that's sort of human nature. Of course, when you have PTSD, every topic is like that. Every topic is like you can potentially think the wrong way. That's why I train myself. But at the same time, I learn how to reframe things. Okay, I hear that. Maybe it is real, but what am I really hearing? What am I looking at? And how should I interpret that? And how does that make me feel? And when I could do that, it was probably the greatest step forward in my healing, because I had realized I'd become a project manager. Yes, I've got PTSD. Yes, I have triggers. Yes, I still have thoughts. And yes, this crap happens. but I'm in charge of it. I'm able to manage it into a productive, positive way. And people, I remember somebody saw my interview on Fox and he said, "You're talking about you killed yourself and you're so composed." I said, "Well, I have PTSD. I just learned how to manage my behaviors. I learned how to talk about it. I'm still responsible for myself. I'm still accountable. I still have to be emotionally mature here." And, this all came back in the book. And that's why I think the book really took off because, this, studying, there's just an ocean of books, of mental health books out there. But there really wasn't anybody I could tell that really did the journaling, which became a book during all the ugly time. And then, over many years, implemented things that they learned to do and how they move their life forward and document the whole thing. I think that's what's, it's 190 pages, it's 30 years of experience into 190 pages, but it's pretty compacted with some really good advice. I think there's actually room for some more chapters, things that I'd like to talk about that I haven't done yet. One would be listening. I had to learn how to listen. That's a whole nother topic. Another one would be praying, how I came to terms with God and just all these terrible things, I've been subjected to, uh, I'm on occasionally on some spiritual podcasts, but there's some others. But one of the things we could do, you talked about doing another episode. Maybe you put it out there and ask the followers, say, "Hey, what do you do with this or this situation, or how have you managed that? How have you come through? What are your thoughts?" Maybe put it out to the people so we can, address them. And maybe you and I have answers. Maybe we don't. Maybe one of the people could say, "Hey, how would you answer this?" I don't know. I think we have an opportunity to educate people here. I think one of the unique things is, of course, and you recognize it. See, you're in the profession. I'm not. I'm an everyday guy. I'm an engineer. I just wrote about my symptoms. Technically, I'm a nobody. It's sort of a cool place to be. I'm just the everyday guy saying, "Hey, I got really sick, and this is what I did." But it's a very unique perspective. I could have never seen this book taking off like it has. There's absolutely no way. We estimate maybe by the end of June, 1 million people have heard my message. And I've been reached out to two larger entities that could multiply that. Um, but I keep it in focus is, one a Beirut brother mentions that, "Kevin, what you're doing is you're filling one sandbag at a time." And I thought that was maybe one of the most brilliant, I'm Navy, so I don't know a damn thing about sandbags. But when I heard that, I said, wow, that's exactly what we're doing here. And moving the needle, helping one people, you help one person at a time. Maybe this podcast will help 20, maybe 100, I don't know, but it may be more because if you help one person, maybe that person gets better and they help other people too. So there's a huge opportunity. Personally, where I think, if we have a little bit of time, I'd like to go into. I think there's two things we need to be doing, and I'm working on this. I've been invited to the governor's office. That's happening this week. I've been invited to another very high-level military person's office to discuss it. But there's two things. First is peer-to-peer support groups. They're absolutely crucial. They sort of exist in some places, but it's never been set up in a manner that's organized and consistent, where it can be repeatable and sustained across all cities, all states. There's nothing there. There's parts, but not there.
Put
And the
pause on
other
that for a
one
second.
is exactly what you're,
So
what's that?
we're talking about the peer groups, and I just wanted to jump in there real quick. Is the reason that a
Uh-huh.
lot of these things are not so self-sustainable across all cities and all states is coming from Long Island, New York, living in San Diego, living in Woodland Park, Colorado. What
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed, and also living now in Billings, Montana, is that a huge difference between what happens is what the community needs. So, like over here in Montana, one out of every 10 people is a veteran. So, 10% of our population is a vet. They also live more of a rougher life than, say, in Long Island. And what I've noticed is giving places the flexibility. to be able to, here is the core guidelines, but you need to be able to flex it to or make it more malleable to
Correct.
what you need. But go on.
Well, I know two programs that exist like that, but they've never. One you, of course, know being in the VA system is the vet center. The vet center model is very good, but surprisingly, many people don't know about it, and there's limitations to access. But I think it's a gold star. It offers a lot. There's actually another one. I don't want to speak of it because I don't know much about it, but it doesn't seem like it should have taken off, but it didn't, and it was with another organization. Both could be flexible to that. Those meetings take on, just like an AA meeting, they take on the tone and the life of those that attend.
So the thing that I do multiple groups here in Billings, Montana, and also virtually across the state of Montana. Yeah, I have two coffee
Mm,
socials that actually help people interact with each other and be able to add a very simple layer of being able to create connection. Another one is how does Trump
excellent.
say again,
Hmm.
sir?
Excellent. Yeah,
Uh,
I'm a huge supporter of that.
Then another one that I do, it's a continuous group. It's how does trauma impact relationships for men? And that goal of that group is actually to be an agitator in people's lives, to help them realize that they're not alone, to be able to help create a narrative and be able to go into therapy to be able to get a bit better. I run a board game group because the men talk better side by side than they do face to face. It's been proven, it's more
Hmm.
as historically into who we are as a species. And that's why the man shed idea kicked off really, really well out of Australia. But when we're
Mm.
looking at groups, and I really am a huge proponent on it, or especially peer to peer, is because it's easy to say that you have a black and white receipt and you will not understand what I've been through than it is to be able to say to them, you know what? Your sucked. My suck sucked. But we have a familiarity of how much our life sucked. And
Well,
you, you, you're
the
not.
thing that group does, and the simplest thing there is that it gives validation. I think it's that simple. The one word validation, saying, I understand. I know I didn't go exactly through that, but I have those same feelings and I know what it's like and it sucks. And I think that human experience of validation is enormous. And it's probably my thought is what drives that. Maybe you have other to add to it, but I simplify things down. I'm an engineer. I'm going to keep things simple.
So, as I did an engineer, very, very bright person, super analytical brain. My ex, like I said, she's an amazing human. And when I look at things, I try to look at all the components that add up into one sum. But then what I realize too is that since we're humans and everybody interpretizes things differently, they take any information, even if I speak extremely clear with the words that I'm using, depending on who's hearing it, they're going to filter it through their own biases, their traumas, their perspectives, or even if I'm wearing, say, if I'm wearing like a three-piece suit, they'll be like, "Oh, he's coming from a place of power. He has to listen." If I come in wearing holy jeans and a holy shirt, they're gonna be thinking I'm crazy, like Damocles. They're gonna be looking at me like I'm just. But it.
I wear a lot of holy jeans, so I guess I'm crazy, but that's good.
But
Yeah,
what I'm saying is
I
that
always try to stay low level.
it's how people internalize the information that they're receiving based off of the output. And there is definitely strong biases, but we did this because of human nature to be able to protect ourselves. And the
Yeah.
generational trauma has actually taught us to be that type of cautious of a human being. But I do, I want to ask you one really, I want you to answer the question where it is, what did you want to get your message clearly across on this episode? And obviously, we're going to do it again. We'll do another episode if you're up for it.
Hmm.
And then I would just want to be able to wrap it up with you because I want to be respectful of your time. And I just want to let you know, Kev, it's been amazing listening to your story.
Thank you. If I was talking to my younger self, the 30-year-old guy, who had attempted suicide. I want to tell the younger people here it gets better. As bad as you think it is right now, if you're able and willing to put work into it, stick with it and take small steps, it will get better. It may feel absolutely terrible. I mean, to a point like you're in excruciating pain, but it does get better if you follow some good basic practices. There's some basic things, example, journaling, all that, but it gets better. The other one is if you are in a relationship, use that person to help you. Because, like, I could tell with my wife when I let my wife into my life and I was honest with her, she saw my shortcomings. I was mature about it, I was accepting it, I was letting her in, letting her influence me, help me. Our relationship, the love we had between each other grew. I look at my wife now, I love my wife. Absolutely. She's my absolutely my best friend. You know, I don't think we've ever had an arguing fight. I tell people we don't yell. We have rules of engagement. We share all of our inner secrets together. I mean, we're like best buddies. And that would be really what I would want to convey today. If you've got a partner there, be mature. If they're telling you you're acting up, say, okay, I am. Look for forgiveness, practice some humility, and use that as an opportunity to turn your life around as a team and work forward together and just say, hey, if it's creating animosity or relationship stuff for your family, say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for doing this, and I'm going to work on it. I wish somebody helped me see that, but I was so sick at the time. You focus first things first. I was just trying to get out of bed in the morning. I was trying to turn on, or I was trying to get to sleep. It was all about me all the time. And life is not about you all the time, particularly if you have kids. Well, the other thing is, I look at my kids, and matter of fact, that they are so well adjusted emotionally. They're so emotionally mature because they saw how my wife and I interacted. They knew my shortcomings and they saw me work at it and they watched me grow. And they said, "Wow, I want to be like that." Because life is unfair and it sucks for everybody, but it's how you handle it and you navigate it and you do it well. And you know, we all have issues. As I like to say, and I'll end on this, there's two types of people in this world: those with problems and those that can't admit that they do. Period. Learn how to manage your problems and practice some humility.
Kevin, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being on.
My honor.